Go ahead.
Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Korenna Goodrick, and I'm a game animation and simulation design major, minoring in writing. And today we'll be looking at my best works. But before we look at my best works, we'll first take a look at who inspires me, starting with C.H. Greenblatt, who was a screenwriter, producer, storyboard artist, cartoonist, animator, and voice actor for Chowder. He inspires me with his use of textures on a 2D plane. I feel it gives my artwork another dimension it wouldn't otherwise have, as well as taking up what would otherwise be negative space. My next influence is Rui Komatsuzaki, who is the lead character concept artist for Danganronpa, and he inspires me in the way that I create my characters, starting from the skeleton and working my way up, which we'll be going over in this next piece with my character concept art. As you can see with this character, Wendy, I start off with the skeleton and I build it up from organic shapes as opposed to boxes and rectangles. And I build it up to the final colored character. This character, she's a wind elemental. So for her, I chose a blue and a blue tone gray color palette because I feel that when I think of wind and weather, that's generally the color that comes to my mind. And the inspiration for her outfit is from ancient Rome and ancient Greece. I was inspired by ancient Roman gladiators and whatnot. Next, we'll be going over my Kitsune model sheet. This piece shows the steps that I take in order to ensure that whoever models or creates a character fully understands what is expected of this character, from the historical significance of each item and color to what each piece would be made from. The next character is Alexander. Here we have his front and back as well as his expressions. Here you can see how I use textures on a 2D character, which takes up all the negative space that would have otherwise been on his sort of half dress. With his character, I wanted a sort of blend of femininity and masculinity and royal wear. So I added metal pieces, which would be kind of reminiscent of, say, like a knight's outfit, but I also made his coat sort of like a royal gown. Next, we'll be going over my environment concept art, starting with the Realm of Soul, which the original was accepted into the second annual Juried SAU Student Art Show. Since then, I added the blue clouds and the stars. I changed the way the stars are in order to make it feel more like space. I chose this color palette because whenever I think of souls, I think of extremely like bright, beautiful colors. And I really wanted to exemplify that with my work. Next, we'll be going over my Edo period environment concept art. Here, I wanted a feeling of peace and an ethereal feel, so I went with a sort of darker light coloring and very, very soft lights in order to achieve this feeling of peace and tranquility with the work. Next, we'll be going over my item concept art and assets, starting with my work for the Monochrome Workshop. The Monochrome Workshop is currently working on a game called Otto's Maniacal Morning, Chapter 1, and I am one of the environment artists. I create the furniture, and this is a sprite sheet of all the furniture. The video game is inspired by 1920s cartoons, so of course I have to go with a strictly black, white, and gray color palette and thick black lines in order to achieve that aesthetic. I also have to make sure that each item is inspired by something that would be found in the 1920s in order to ensure that the aesthetic is true through and through throughout the game. Next, we'll be looking at the space plants from the Game Development Camp project. I was one of the camp counselors for the Game Dev Camp here at SAU. And as the camp counselor, one of the jobs that I was given was to help create environment assets. I was in charge of some of the plants, and each of these plants is inspired by a plant you would find in real life, such as the saguaro cactus, the bleeding tooth mushroom, and the corpse flower, which inspired the flower cannon, which ended up being one of the enemies in the game. Next, we'll be looking at the Yokai Rush Lantern concept. Here, I illustrated what the lantern would be intended for, which it would essentially light up whenever an enemy was about to rush out the door in order to warn the player beforehand. I used dark lines in order to keep that Japanese ink painting aesthetic to better, because the game was inspired by Japanese mythology and whatnot. Of course, I added details in order to illustrate this, as well as what textures would be used for each object. Next, we'll be looking at some of my illustrations. The first one being the eyes. The eyes, I use blue in order to, this is sort of a self-portrait. Essentially, this is me and a representation of how I feel when people stare at me. I get extremely nervous, especially whenever I make a mistake, as shown here. And this piece is an Archive piece, so when you scan it with the Archive app, it'll show a video and a reading by myself of my poem, The Eyes, from my zine, Hope to Cope. I illustrated and wrote this poem myself. Of course, it is a poem about how I feel regarding being stared at, and I use that imagery with the giant eye, because that's how it essentially feels to me whenever I'm being stared at. Next, we'll be going over my 3D renders. The first one being a 3D modeled recreation of Philosopher in Meditation by Rembrandt. Given that the painting is extremely dark, it required a lot of careful attention and detail in order to ensure that I get it as close to the painting as possible. Most of the textures were from photographs, but some of the textures, like the textures on the wall, were painted by myself. Next is the Bubble Space Sword, which is a Damascus sword with galaxy textured gems surrounded by bubbles in a dark blue space. I wanted to mix sci-fi and fantasy with this piece, so I used my bright colors and galactic textures for the gems, as well as Damascus, because Damascus is a swirling metal, which I felt really exemplified the galactic effect with the sword. And then next is my cat's eye ring. I wanted to create a piece of jewelry that I would wear and that was extremely unique. In order to create the eye without causing a stretch in texture, what I did was I took a flat cylinder, textured it with the eye, and then I put a glass textured dome over it. Much like you would in real life, you would have the picture underneath a glass marble in order to project the eye onto the glass. I went with green, and I generally like solid color backgrounds and playing with light in order to make it more dynamic, like I did here, where this was just a solid green background, and using light, I created the dynamic that makes it feel more like there's more going on in the background. And that is my presentation. Thank you. And you can see my art station at this link. Thank you.